Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The town of Francis, Utah sits quietly in the Camas Valley, cradled by mountains that turn gold in autumn and silver under winter snow. It is the kind of place where neighbors wave from driveways, where children grow up with wide open skies above them, and where the idea of violent crime feels as distant as the horizon. It was here, in a home that appeared by every outward measure to be a picture of suburban prosperity, that a marriage was slowly dying, not from indifference or heartbreak, but by something far more deliberate and far more dark. The story of Corey and Eric Richens begins, as so many American stories do, with the promise of a good life. Eric Richens was 39 years old, a hard-working man who had built a stable future for his family in the mountains of Summit County. He was known to those close to him as dependable and generous, a man who loved his 3 sons and poured himself into the kind of quiet, steady life that most people only dream of. Corey, his wife, was sharp and ambitious. She carried herself with confidence, involved herself in the community, and by the early 2020s had cultivated the image of a devoted mother raising a family in one of Utah's most picturesque corners. To anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a family that had everything. But behind the closed doors of their home, a different story was being written. By 2020, Eric had begun to notice something deeply wrong with the family's finances. Bills that didn't add up, loans he hadn't agreed to, lines of credit taken out in his name, or against properties he co-owned, without his knowledge. As he dug deeper, the picture that emerged was unsettling. His wife had allegedly been siphoning money, accumulating debts that stretched well beyond $1 million. When the full weight of that discovery settled on him, Eric did something quiet and deliberate. He consulted an attorney, revised his will, established a trust, and named his sister as trustee. He removed Corey as the primary beneficiary of his estate. He did this privately, without confrontation, as though he understood that the person he was protecting himself from was still sleeping in the same house. What Eric may not have known was that Corey had also, during this same period, secretly taken out nearly $2 million in life insurance policies on his life. Policies he had not agreed to, contracts signed in a manner as forgery and fraud. The financial architecture she was allegedly building told a chilling story. A woman who had positioned herself to profit enormously from her husband's death, even as the life they had built together began to crack and splinter beneath the weight of her secrets. And Corey had another secret. She was in a relationship with another man. While Eric went about his days trusting that his marriage, however strained, was still a marriage, his wife had opened her heart and her future to someone else. Her boyfriend had sent her a photograph of 2 people kissing. She responded with the words, "Love you." Then, she went and prepared her husband a drink. The drink was a Moscow Mule, ginger beer, vodka, lime, served cold in the kind of copper mug that has become fashionable at dinner parties. It was the sort of thing a wife might make for a husband at the end of a long evening, an ordinary gesture of domestic life. But this particular Moscow Mule contained something Eric never agreed to consume. Fentanyl, one of the most powerful and lethal synthetic opioids ever synthesized. A drug so potent that even a small amount can stop a person's heart. To understand why that detail is so devastating, one must understand what fentanyl is. Originally developed as a medical anesthetic, fentanyl in its illicit form has flooded American streets over the past decade and become the leading driver of overdose deaths in the country. It is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine. A few milligrams, an amount smaller than a few grains of salt, can kill an adult. Eric Richens had no history of drug use. He had never sought fentanyl, never purchased it, never touched it. The substance found in his body on the morning of March 4th, 2022, had been placed there by someone else. The story of how that fentanyl came to be in Corey's possession is one of the most unsettling threads of the entire case. Court documents revealed that between late 2021 and early 2022, Corey had been communicating with a contact connected to the drug trade. Through this channel, she obtained hydrocodone first, a prescription opioid, and then asked for something stronger. The words she allegedly used were memorable and deeply specific. She asked for powerful sedative. She was looking for something that would render a person unconscious, or worse. Her contact pointed her toward fentanyl instead, and she accepted. She obtained the drug at least 4 times. 3 of those occasions came before Eric's death. The first alleged attempt on Eric's life took place on Valentine's Day, 2022, a date that pulses with particular irony in the telling of this case. Corey laced her husband's preferred sandwich with fentanyl. He ate it and became seriously ill. He did not die, but he felt sick enough that it shook him. In the days that followed, Eric confided in a friend. He said he believed his wife had tried to poison him. He said it plainly, the words carried by whatever strange courage a person summons when they have to say something terrible about someone they once loved. And then, according to court records, he told his family, "If I die, you need to take a look at her. I think she's trying to kill me." Those words did not save his life. 2 weeks after Valentine's Day, Corey allegedly obtained more fentanyl that she had simply recalibrated, tried again, acquired more, and waited for another opportunity. That opportunity came on the night of March 3rd, 2022, and stretched into the early hours of March 4th. What passed between Corey and Eric that evening, what they said to each other, whether there was warmth or tension, or just the practiced silence of a strained marriage, is something only she knows. What the evidence established was this: Eric Richens drank a Moscow Mule. And sometime after midnight, in the home where his children slept, he lost consciousness and never woke up. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, Corey called 911. She told the dispatcher she had found her husband unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived at the house in Francis, Utah, a small, quiet town roughly 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, and found Eric exactly as she described. They worked on him, but there was nothing to be done. Eric Richens was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 39 years old. His 3 boys were asleep down the hall. In the days that followed, the official machinery of grief swung into motion. There was a funeral, and there were condolences, and there were neighbors bringing food to the door. Corey accepted their sympathy and grieved publicly with the practiced composure of a woman who had lost her husband too soon. The medical examiner completed a toxicology report. The results would take time to process, as they often do, but when they came back, they told a story that could not be explained away. Eric Richens had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his blood at the time of his death. The drug had been ingested orally, swallowed in a drink or food, not injected, not inhaled. It was classified as illicit, meaning it had come from the black market, not a pharmacy. A man with no history of drug use had somehow consumed a quantity of illegal fentanyl large enough to kill 5 people. The medical examiner ruled his death a fentanyl overdose. Investigators began to ask questions. The questions led to Corey. As investigators quietly built their case through much of 2022 and into 2023, Corey Richens was building something of her own. Less than a year after Eric's death, she completed and published a children's book about grief. The book told the story of a father who watches over his family from heaven, offering comfort and love even in the separation of death. She dedicated it to her husband, whom she described in the dedication as amazing. The book received media attention. It was the kind of story that attracted sympathy, a grieving mother channeling her pain into something beautiful for other children who had lost parents. She gave interviews. She discussed loss, healing, and moving forward. For weeks after the book was published, in May 2023, police arrested Corey Richens and charged her with her husband's murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and, soon enough, through the national media. The story had an almost impossible quality to it. A grief author, a children's book about a watching over father, an arrest for the murder of the very man the book was dedicated to. It was the kind of case that forces people to sit with the uncomfortable reality that the face of evil rarely looks like what we imagine. Corey Richens did not look like a murderer. She looked like a mother. She looked like a widow. She had written a book about love surviving death, and prosecutors alleged she had manufactured that death herself. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense team argued that the prosecution could not conclusively prove she had administered the drug to Eric. Connecting the acquisition of fentanyl to the actual act of placing it in his drink, they argued, was a chain of inference, not certainty. Her attorney, Sky Lazaro, maintained that the evidence was circumstantial and that the burden of proof had not been met. Curry maintained her innocence through the lengthy pretrial process, through hearings and continuances, through the grinding pace of the American legal system. The trial finally began in early 2026, nearly 4 years after Eric's death. Over 13 days, prosecutors presented 42 witnesses. They called Carmen Lauber, the house cleaner who served as Corey's connection to the drug supply. Lauber testified under oath that she had obtained fentanyl for Corey on multiple occasions, 3 times before Eric's death and once afterward. A first-hand account of the drug acquisition chain that began with Corey's requests and ended in Eric's body. Prosecutors also laid out the financial picture in meticulous detail. They showed the jury the insurance policies, nearly $2 million worth, that Corey had allegedly taken out on Eric's life without his knowledge, using forged signatures. They presented the debts she had accumulated, exceeding $1.8 million. They walked the jury through Eric's quiet decision to change his will, to move his estate into a trust, to cut Corey out, a decision he had made years before his death because he no longer trusted the woman he had married. And then they presented the devastating detail that none of this planning had worked out as Corey allegedly intended. Because Eric had quietly removed her from the will, she stood to inherit far less than she expected, even with the insurance policies. The prosecution also introduced the digital record of the moments leading up to Eric's death, the text message from her boyfriend, the love you response, and then the Moscow Mule. The sequence of events, laid end to end, told a story of a woman whose private life and financial desperation had collided into something irreversible. The defense held its ground, challenging witnesses, questioning the integrity of the drug chain of custody, and emphasizing the lack of direct physical evidence of Corey placing fentanyl into her husband's drink. But the weight of 42 witnesses, the financial paper trail, the testimony of Carmen Lauber, and the words Eric himself had spoken to his friend and family, "I think she's trying to kill me," were harder to argue away than any single piece of physical evidence. After 13 days of testimony, the jury of 8 people received the case. They deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours. After nearly 4 years of investigation, arrest, hearings, and a 2-week trial, 12 strangers needed only 3 hours to arrive at an answer. On March 16, 2026, the foreperson of the jury handed the verdict form to Judge Mrazek. The judge instructed the courtroom, "No outward reactions, hands folded. If you feel overcome, look down." Then he read the verdict aloud, count by count, while Corey Richens stood beside her attorneys in a floral blouse. Guilty of aggravated murder. Guilty of attempted aggravated murder. Guilty of insurance fraud, 2 counts. Guilty of forgery. As each word landed, Corey lowered her head. The jury was polled one by one, all 8 voices, all 8 giving the same answer. Guilty. 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 In the gallery, members of Eric's family sat with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a very long time for something they were not sure would ever come. The aggravated murder conviction in Utah carries a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Sentencing was scheduled for May 13, 2026. What lingers in the aftermath of this case is not simply the horror of the crime, but the long shadow it casts over ordinary life. Eric Richens had suspected what was happening to him. He had told people. He had even taken legal steps to protect his estate. And still he died in his own home, in the place where his children slept, with 5 times a lethal dose of poison in his body. He was 39 years old, and the person he had trusted most in the world was allegedly the one who ended his life. His 3 sons will grow up without their father. They will, perhaps someday, learn the full story, not from a children's book about a father watching over his family from heaven, but from court transcripts and news archives and the quiet, painful knowledge of what was done to the man who loved them. Corey Richens, meanwhile, faces the possibility of spending the rest of her life in a Utah prison. convicted not only of murder, but of the attempted murder of her husband on Valentine's Day, and of the financial crimes she allegedly used to set the stage for everything that followed. The jury that heard her case needed only 3 hours to decide that the evidence was not circumstantial, not ambiguous, not a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was, in their unanimous judgment, proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The Moscow mountains surrounding the Kamas Valley still rise above the town of Francis, indifferent and beautiful, the way mountains always are. The home where Eric Richens died stands somewhere in their shadow. And somewhere in the machinery of justice, a mother of 3 waits to learn exactly how many years she will pay for what the law has determined she did. For the debt she accumulated, for the poison she allegedly obtained, for the drink she allegedly prepared, and for the 3 words she sent to another man just before she did it. Story 2. The hills of eastern Kentucky have always kept secrets. Folded into the Appalachian landscape, tucked between ridgelines and winding creek roads, the small communities of Floyd County carry the kind of quietness that feels earned rather than peaceful. A quietness shaped by generations of hard work, tight kinship, and the understanding that life here demands resilience above almost everything else. It is a place where people know their neighbors, where a person's name carries weight, where the prominence of certain families reaches quietly into the institutions of the town itself. And it is a place where, on a warm June morning in 2023, that quietness was shattered by something that would force the whole region to confront the most uncomfortable of questions. What happens when the powerful and the vulnerable collide, and no one is held to account? Amber Spradlin had spent her entire life learning to survive within those hills. She was 38 years old in the summer of 2023, a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with a warmth. Amber had been dealt one of the cruelest hands a child can be given. When she was still very young, her mother was murdered. That particular wound never fully closes. Amber was raised by her grandparents, Merle and Margie Osborne, in the close, steady love of a home that did its best to fill a space that could never be entirely filled. She grew up in the hills, surrounded by cousins and aunts and the dense familial fabric of Appalachian life. She became, by all accounts, a woman of resilience, not the performative kind, but the quiet, daily kind that simply gets up and keeps going. By the time she reached her late 30s, Amber was working as a hostess at the Brick House restaurant in Prestonsburg, the county seat of Floyd County. It was honest, steady work in a community she had known her whole life. She moved through her days with the straightforward rhythms of someone who had learned not to ask too much of the future. A shift at the restaurant, a drive home through the familiar hollows, the comfort of people she had known for years. She was not a person who sought out trouble. She was a person who had already survived more than her share of it. On the evening of Saturday, June 17th, 2023, Amber finished her shift at the Brick House restaurant and stepped into a night that would be the last of her life. The hours that followed were ordinary in the way that final hours so often are: unremarkable, casual, the kind of evening that a person might spend dozens of times in a lifetime without event. Amber ended up in the company of a group that included a man named Roy Kidd, who was an acquaintance, and who would later become the person who found her body. The group made their way to the Seasons Inn and Restaurant in the nearby town of Martin, an after-hours drinking spot owned by Dr. Michael McKinney II, a prominent and well-known dentist in the Prestonsburg community. Dr. McKinney was a significant figure in Floyd County. He was not merely a dentist. He was a man whose name opened doors, a person whose professional standing and social connections wove through the community's institutions. He knew the right people. He moved in the right circles. Among those circles was his friendship with the chief of police of the nearby town of Prestonsburg. After the gathering at the Seasons Inn, Dr. McKinney, his son, Michael McKinney III, known to everyone around him as MK, and the group including Amber Spradlin and Roy Kidd moved the evening to Dr. McKinney's private residence on Arkansas Creek, outside of Prestonsburg. It was a transition that seemed natural enough on a Saturday night, moving a social gathering from a public space to a private home. 6 people walked through the door of that house that night. Only one of them would not walk back out. Somewhere in the deep quiet of that early Sunday morning, June 18th, 2023, Amber Spradlin was attacked. She was less than 5 feet tall, and she fought. She fought with everything she had, because her small hands bore the marks of a person who had refused to surrender without resistance. Defensive wounds on her body. Biological material collected from beneath her fingernails, material that did not belong to her. She had scratched at her attacker. She had reached out in the darkness and taken something of them with her. She was stabbed at least 11 times in her head, her neck, her face, and her torso. At some point after the attack, Amber's body came to rest on the living room couch of the McKinney residence. She was left there, not placed with any tenderness, not attended to, not given the mercy of a call for help, but left as though she were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a human being who was dying. And in those hours before anyone called for help, something else was happening inside that house. Something deliberate and calculated and deeply cold. The security cameras that had been installed in the McKinney residence, surveillance equipment positioned directly to capture the living area where Amber lay, were removed. The DVR unit, the hard drive, the recorded footage that might have shown exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it, gone. Removed from the house before a single emergency call was made. Surveillance footage from outside the property would later show M.K. McKinney's truck leaving the area just before 8:30 in the morning. He drove east, back toward Moorhead, Kentucky, where he lived. He left without calling 911. He left without reporting what had happened. He left. What happened next would become a defining detail of the case. The moment when the weight of influence made itself felt in the most explicit way possible. At approximately 10:29 in the morning, before he dialed the emergency services number, Dr. Michael McKinney too placed a call to his close friend, the chief of police of Prestonsburg. The two men spoke for 8 full minutes. 8 minutes, while Amber Spradlin lay dead on a couch in the next room. When investigators later asked the police chief about the content of that conversation, he stated that he had simply advised Dr. McKinney to contact 911. That was the entirety of his account. 8 minutes to advise a man to make a phone call that any person in the country understands is the first thing you do when someone is injured or dying. At 10:37 in the morning, Dr. McKinney finally called 911. In the recording of that call, he told the dispatcher that it appeared someone had broken into his home and done something to the woman on his couch. He spoke of the injuries to her throat in clinical terms, injuries that responding officers, upon arriving, initially could not fully assess because of the position in which Amber's body had come to rest. The cause of her death was not immediately apparent to the first officers at the scene. By the time those officers arrived, the house had already been altered. The cameras were gone. MK was already hours down the road, and the window in which the most critical forensic evidence might have been preserved and documented had been narrowing since the moment the attack occurred. News of Amber Spradlin's death moved through Floyd County and the surrounding communities like a current. She was known. She was one of them, a woman raised in those hills, shaped by the same landscape and the same hardships that had shaped everyone around her. And the circumstances of her death, fragmented as the early details were, immediately raised questions that the community could not set aside. Why had it taken until mid-morning for a 911 call to be made, if Amber had been attacked in the early hours of Sunday? Why had the police chief been called first? Where was the surveillance footage? Why had multiple people apparently left that house without alerting anyone? Who had removed those cameras, and when and why? Amber's family, her grandparents, her cousin Dr. Debbie Hall, her Aunt Missy Sammons, began speaking publicly almost immediately, pressing for answers, demanding to know who had done this to their daughter, their cousin, their family. Dr. Debbie Hall, in interview after interview over the months that followed, was unyielding. Her family would not stop until someone was held responsible. The investigation moved to the Kentucky State Police, which took over the case with the gravity it demanded. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing the night, interviewing everyone who had been present, analyzing phone records, examining the physical evidence that remained at the scene, and searching for the surveillance footage that had been stripped from the property before the police arrived. Roy Kidd, who had been with Amber that evening, gave investigators a lengthy interview, nearly 95 minutes, the day after she was killed. His account would later become part of the legal proceedings, and questions about the full extent of what he had witnessed would continue to surface as the case developed. 1 month after the murder, the Prestonsburg chief of police resigned from his position. No official explanation was given. The resignation was quiet, but in a community that was watching every development with mounting intensity, it was impossible to separate from the question of what he had known and when, and what he had chosen to do with that knowledge. For Amber's family, the first anniversary of her death, June 18, 2024, arrived without an arrest. 12 months. No one in handcuffs. Dr. Debbie Hall stood before cameras on that anniversary and said, with a steadiness that must have cost her enormously, that time had not helped. That every month without an answer had made the wound deeper, not shallower. That they were waiting. They kept waiting. Then, in late July 2024, 13 months after Amber Spradlin was found dead on a couch in the McKinney home, the arrests came. M.K. McKinney, 23 years old at the time of the murder, 24 by the time the handcuffs closed around his wrists, was charged with murder. He was also charged with complicity in relation to the evidence tampering. His father, Dr. Michael McKinney II, was charged with multiple counts of tampering with physical evidence. A third man, Josh Mullins, 24 years old, was charged on the same grounds. All three pleaded not guilty. MK was held on a bail of $5 million. It was a figure that reflected the gravity of the charges and the strength of what investigators had assembled against him. For Amber's family, the arrests brought something that had been absent for more than a year. Not resolution, not peace, but the first concrete sign that the system had not entirely abandoned her. The evidence that prosecutors had gathered was, on paper, deeply incriminating. The biological material collected from beneath Amber's fingernails, the material she had managed to take from her attacker in those terrible final moments, was sent to the Kentucky State Police Crime Lab for DNA analysis. Prosecutors would later announce in court that the DNA was a match for M.K. McKinney. The fresh scratches that investigators had documented on M.K.'s forearms when he had come to the state police post to provide a DNA sample in the days after the murder. Those scratches suddenly carried enormous significance. The timeline of his truck's departure captured on surveillance footage. The physical evidence that placed him in the house during the critical hours. The absence of any innocent explanation for why he had driven away without making a single call for help. But the case was not simple, and it was not quick. In October 2025, more than 2 years after Amber's death, the Kentucky State Police Crime Lab discovered what was believed to be new blood evidence on several items connected to the case. That evidence required additional DNA testing, a process that takes time, that demands precision, that cannot be rushed without risking the integrity of the entire case. The trial, which had been scheduled for December 2025, was pushed back. By December, it had been rescheduled again. As of early 2026, the trial is set for May of that year. Though as recently as March 2026, prosecutors have again filed motions seeking delays due to the continuing pace of evidence testing. Alongside the criminal proceedings, Amber's family pursued a parallel avenue of accountability that reached beyond the individual actors in the house that night. In the spring of 2024, a wrongful death lawsuit was filed naming not only the McKinneys, but also the city of Prestonsburg and Floyd County officials, alleging that a failure to maintain adequate around-the-clock 911 emergency coverage had played a role in Amber's death. The argument pressed forward by family attorneys was specific and damning. Local leaders had been warned before Amber's murder that the community would be endangered without continuous 911 service. They had been warned, and they had not acted. City and county officials sought to have the lawsuit dismissed, claiming governmental immunity, the legal protection that shields public bodies from certain civil claims. The argument over that immunity was still being heard in court in January 2026. For Dr. Debbie Hall and the Osborne family, this broader reckoning mattered deeply. They were not content to hold only the man who swung the blade responsible. They wanted accountability for every failure, every phone call made to protect a friend instead of a victim, every piece of surveillance equipment removed before investigators arrived, every hour of silence that passed while Amber lay alone. They wanted the full weight of what happened on that night in June 2023 to be laid out in a courtroom, in the light, for everyone to see. What makes the case of Amber Spradlin so deeply painful, beyond the violence of her death, beyond the years of waiting, beyond the legal machinery grinding slowly toward a conclusion, is the particular cruelty of her story. Here was a woman who had already survived a childhood that broke open at the seams. She had lost her mother to murder before she was old enough to understand what murder meant. She had been raised by grandparents who loved her with everything they had. She had built a life in the hills where she was born, working honest work, surrounded by family and community. She had endured things that would have dismantled a person with a flimsier kind of courage. And then, at 38 years old, on an ordinary summer night after an ordinary shift at a restaurant where she greeted people with warmth and steadiness, she walked into a house from which she would not return. She fought. This is something her family and everyone who has followed this case knows. She fought until the last possible moment, and she left evidence of that fight behind. Evidence scraped into the forearms of a young man who drove away in the morning as though nothing had happened. She was a small woman, and she fought like someone who had learned, over an entire lifetime, that survival was worth every last effort. The people of Floyd County have not forgotten her. The relentless public advocacy of her family, all of it speaks to the same insistence that Amber Spradlin was a person whose life had value, whose death demands accounting, and whose story does not end with a body on a couch and 3 men who pleaded not guilty. The trial is coming. The evidence is being tested. The courtroom waits. Somewhere in those Appalachian hills, in a home without its brightest presence, Merle and Margie Osborne, the grandparents who raised a little girl after the worst possible beginning, wait for a justice that has taken far too long to arrive. Amber Spradlin deserved a full life. She deserved the ordinary future that every human being is owed. And she deserved, at the very minimum, to be found in time. She deserved someone in that house to pick up a phone and call for help before the sun came up, to choose her life over their own protection. That choice was never made for her. The only thing she could do was fight and leave behind what she fought for, and trust that the people who loved her would carry it the rest of the way. They're still carrying it. Story 3. There are losses in the world that defy language. Moments of grief so complete and so incomprehensible that the words available to describe them feel thin and insufficient, like a single candle held against a vast, permanent darkness. The death of a child is one such loss. Not the idea of it in the abstract, not the statistics of it in a report, but the specific, devastating, irreversible loss of one particular small person who was known and loved, and who had a name and a birthday and a best friend. Charlotte Willow Patterson was 3 years old. She loved to play. She had friends who would miss her in the ordinary, inarticulate way that small children miss one another, wondering, in their uncomplicated hearts, why their friend could not come out anymore, why the visits had stopped, why the world had suddenly become quieter in the places where Charlotte used to be. She had a mother who called her a birthday gift, because she had arrived 3 days after her mother's own birthday, and who would carry the memory of her for every remaining day of her life. Charlotte Willow Patterson was 3 years old, and she was alive, and then she was not. And the story of how that happened is one that the city of Sandusky, Ohio, and everyone who loved her will never fully recover from. Sandusky is a city on the southern shore of Lake Erie in northern Ohio, a modest, working city of about 70,000 people, the kind of place that carries the ordinary weight of ordinary American life. It is known for Cedar Point, the great amusement park that sits on a peninsula jutting into the lake, whose roller coasters rise and fall against the horizon on summer days in a kind of defiant cheerfulness. It is a city where people know each other, where neighborhoods have histories, where the fabric of community runs through streets and churches and schoolyards. It is not, by any measure, a city that expects the kind of darkness that arrived on the evening of September 12, 2024. That evening began like any other, the last warm echoes of summer still in the air, the lake glittering in the late light, families and neighbors moving through the ordinary rhythms of a Thursday in September. And then, just after 9 o'clock at night, a phone call was made that would end all ordinary things. The call came into a police dispatcher from a man named Devin S. O'Brien, 30 years old, who lived on the 4000 block of Venice Road, a stretch of U.S. Route 6 that runs along the lake shore. He told the dispatcher, in a statement that would later be examined in excruciating detail, that he believed his girlfriend's daughter and dog had been taken. He used the word taken. He presented himself, in those first moments, as someone alarmed, as someone reaching out because something was wrong, as a man who was worried. The word taken implies an outside force, an intruder, a perpetrator other than the person making the call. The word taken, in the mouth of the person who had caused what had happened, was the first lie of the evening, and it was the lie that police would begin to dismantle within hours. Sandusky police officers arrived at the address on Venice Road shortly after the call. What they found inside that house shattered the composure of officers who had trained for the most difficult moments of police work. They found Charlotte Willow Patterson, 3 years old, dead. She was a child who had, some time earlier that evening, been alive and present in the home she shared with her mother and Devin O'Brien. The officers who entered that house and encountered what had been done to her were described in the months that followed, by those who knew them and worked alongside them, as deeply, lastingly affected. The kind of effect that does not wash off after a shift ends, that does not diminish with the passage of days or weeks. Seasoned police officers who had attended countless difficult scenes found this one in a category of its own. Devin O'Brien was arrested by Sandusky police that same night. He was taken into custody and booked into Erie County Jail the following morning. The speed of the arrest was significant. It spoke to the clarity of what investigators had found and to the immediate weight of evidence against the man who had placed that 9 o'clock phone call. While O'Brien was processed into the jail, Charlotte's small body was transported to the Lucas County Coroner's office. The autopsy, the formal clinical examination that would confirm in the language of forensic science what had been done to a 3-year-old girl, was conducted the following morning. Its findings were made public by Sandusky Police Chief Jared Oliver. Charlotte Willow Patterson had died as a result of strangulation. She had suffered blunt force trauma. She had been sexually assaulted. 3 separate findings. 3 separate violations. The strangulation was the cause of death. The thing that had extinguished the life from a child who weighed no more than 30 pounds and who could not have understood what was happening to her or defended herself against it. The blunt force trauma and the assault told the story of violence that preceded and accompanied the act of killing, a story of prolonged harm inflicted on someone utterly defenseless. Police Chief Oliver delivered these findings to the press without embellishment, in the measured, careful language that law enforcement uses when the facts themselves are more terrible than any additional framing could make them. The city of Sandusky listened and absorbed what it was told in a collective silence that was, in its own way, a form of grief. Charlotte's mother, Miranda Shepard, had entrusted her daughter's safety to Devin O'Brien. That trust, the ordinary, necessary trust that a mother places in the person who is present in her home and in her child's daily life, had been exploited in the most unforgivable way. Shepard described Charlotte in the months and years that followed as her sweet, kind, and loving child. She called her her forever birthday gift, a phrase that carries its own tender specificity, speaking of the 3 days between her own birthday and the day this child arrived in the world and became the most important thing in it. Charlotte was not merely a child to Miranda Shepard. She was the shape of her life. She was the reason mornings had meaning. In the weeks that followed the arrest, the community of Sandusky found its way to the only response available in the face of such a loss. It gathered. A candlelight vigil was held for Charlotte in September 2024, attended by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had never met the child but who felt, with the particular solidarity of a community confronting its own grief, that they needed to stand somewhere in the dark and hold a light. It was a gesture that accomplished nothing in the practical sense. It could not undo what had been done, could not restore what had been taken, but it was not nothing. It was the community saying, with candles instead of words, that Charlotte Willow Patterson had been here, that she had been loved, and that what happened to her mattered. Authorities, operating under Ohio's Marsy's Law, a victims' rights protection statute that restricts the public identification of crime victims in certain circumstances, never officially named the child. That legal protection, designed with good intentions and genuine care for victims and their families, created a strange tension in the public consciousness of the case. The name Charlotte Willow Patterson circulated through online posts, through community vigils, through the heartbroken GoFundMe campaigns launched by those who knew her family. A fundraiser established to support Miranda Shepard raised thousands of dollars from people who had seen Charlotte's name attached to the story of a small girl lost, and wanted to do something, anything, to acknowledge the weight of that loss. The law said one name, the community said another, and both pointed, in their different registers, to the same irreducible fact: a child was gone. In October 2024, an Erie County grand jury returned an indictment against Devin S. O'Brien. The charges were extensive and devastating in their cumulative specificity: 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of assaults, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of felonious assault, 1 count of strangulation, 1 count of tampering with evidence, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. Each charge represented not merely a legal category, but a documented act, something investigators had found, measured, and recorded in their examination of what had occurred inside that house on Venice Road. The breadth of the indictment reflected the thoroughness of the investigation and the extent of what Charlotte had endured. The charge of tampering with evidence suggested that O'Brien had taken steps, in the period between the time of Charlotte's death and the time of his phone call to police, to alter or conceal something. The charge of gross abuse of a corpse indicated that what had been done to Charlotte had not ended with her death. These were the charges that extended the horror of the case beyond its central, unbearable fact, and into territory that those who loved Charlotte found almost impossible to engage with: the clinical framing of a court document applied to the body of a 3-year-old girl who had, on the morning of September 12th, still been a living child with a whole afternoon ahead of her. The legal proceedings that followed were, by their nature, slow. Courts operate on their own timescale: hearings postponed, dates rescheduled, continuances granted, months passing in the accumulation of procedural necessity. O'Brien appeared before Erie County Common Pleas Court Judge Tig Tone on multiple occasions through 2024 and 2025, each appearance reported in the Sandusky Register and the Advertiser Tribune, each one followed by another date set further down the calendar. His attorneys sought a mental health evaluation early in the proceedings. The evaluation, conducted in October 2024, found that O'Brien was not a danger to himself, a finding that, in its clinical neutrality, stood in stark contrast to what the evidence indicated about what he had done to a child in his care. Miranda Shepard, throughout this extended period, was required to exist in the liminal space between grief and resolution, the particular, exhausting condition of a person who has lost something irreplaceable and is waiting for the legal system to confirm what she already knew. There is a specific cruelty to that waiting that is rarely fully acknowledged. The knowledge that the person responsible for her daughter's death was alive, was present in a courtroom, was afforded due process and legal representation and procedural protections, while Charlotte was not present at all, had no more voice, no more days, no more mornings. Shepard endured that waiting for over a year. The resolution came in December 2025. Devin S. O'Brien appeared before Judge Tig Tone and entered a guilty plea to 1 count of aggravated murder. The plea was reached as part of an agreement with the Erie County Prosecutor's Office, an arrangement in which the remaining charges were dismissed and the death penalty was taken off the table. In exchange for pleading guilty, O'Brien would avoid the uncertainty and the further trauma of a trial. The family would be spared the ordeal of a lengthy courtroom proceeding in which every detail of what had been done to a 3-year-old child would be laid out in public testimony. Before Judge Tone pronounced the sentence, the courtroom was given something that the legal machinery of a guilty plea can sometimes obscure: the human truth of what had been lost. Sarah Reynolds, the Victim Assistance Director at the Erie County Prosecutor's Office, stood and read Miranda Shepard's victim impact statement aloud into the record. In it, Shepard described Charlotte as the sweet, kind, and loving child she had been, the forever birthday gift, who had filled the years of her short life with the particular warmth and noise and need that small children bring to the world. She described how O'Brien's actions had continued to affect her in the months since Charlotte's death: the shape of the absence, the size of the silence, the impossibility of explaining to Charlotte's young friends why she could not come out to play anymore. You can't explain to a child the reason why they can't visit or play with their best friend anymore, she said. The simplicity of that sentence, its focus not on the adult dimensions of the case, but on the small, ordinary relationships of childhood, was devastating in its specificity. Charlotte had friends, small children with small hearts who had loved her and missed her and been given no language adequate to understand why she was gone. O'Brien was then given the opportunity to address the court. He turned briefly toward the family and spoke in a sentence whose inadequacy no one in the room could have missed. "I'm very sorry for the suffering I have made you endure. I know my words will in no way ever ease your pain in losing her." The words were spoken. They were entered into the record. And they were, as O'Brien himself acknowledged, insufficient, not because the sentiment behind them was necessarily false, but because there is no sentence in the English language, or in any language, that rises to the event of what had been done in that house on Venice Road. Miranda Shepherd had said that Charlotte had been taken from everyone who loved her. An apology is not a return. Judge Tigtone sentenced Devin S. O'Brien to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no release date. There would be no parole board hearing at which the question of his freedom might be considered. He would remain incarcerated until his death, a sentence that represented, in the formal vocabulary of the law, the maximum consequence available after the agreement that removed the death penalty from the table. Erie County Sheriff's deputies led O'Brien from the courtroom in handcuffs. He was taken out of the room, out of the visible world of proceedings and statements and impact testimony, and into the institutional machinery that would contain him for the remainder of his life. What remained after the sentence was delivered and the courtroom emptied was what always remains after these proceedings conclude: the absence, unchanged by the verdict, of the person who was lost. Charlotte Willow Patterson would not come home because O'Brien had been sentenced. The mornings would not return. The birthday gifts would not be given. The small friends who had lost their playmate would grow up without fully understanding what they had lost, carrying only the fact of the gap in a way that children carry most of what they cannot yet name. Miranda Shepherd would carry the particular, permanent burden of a mother who has outlived her child, and who lived, for more than a year after her daughter's death, in the full knowledge of how she had died. No sentence mitigates that knowledge. No verdict erases it. The case of Charlotte Willow Patterson stands as something more than a crime story. It stands as a story about trust, the trust that is placed necessarily and inevitably in the people who are present in a child's daily life, the trust that is extended by a mother to the person sharing her home, the trust that small children extend to every adult in their world, because that is the only way they know how to be in it. Charlotte could not have protected herself. She had no awareness that the danger in her life wore a familiar face, that it was present at mealtimes and bedtimes, that it had been admitted through the front door by the mother who loved her. The crime committed against Charlotte was not the violence of a stranger appearing from outside the boundaries of her known world. It was the betrayal of everything inside those boundaries. Sandusky, Ohio, carried the weight of this case in the way that communities carry their worst chapters, not by forgetting but by holding on. Charlotte Willow Patterson was not merely a case number or a court file. She was a child who had been born 3 days after her mother's birthday, who had been called a forever gift, who had friends who could not understand where she had gone. She was 3 years old. She deserved the world. And the city of Sandusky, and the family she left behind, will carry that fact forward, in candlelight, in impact statements, in the quiet, permanent love of a mother who calls her daughter her birthday gift long after the gift has been taken away. Story 4. There are places in America where the winters are brutal, not only in temperature but in silence, where the cold settles across flat, open land and seems to hold the whole world still. Arkansas City, Kansas, is one such place, a small, close-knit town in Cowley County. It is the kind of community where neighbors know one another's names, where the local college is a point of communal pride, and where a girl like Jodie Sanderholm could grow up feeling genuinely safe. Jodie was 19 years old in January 2007, and she had all the quiet, luminous energy of someone who had found her purpose early. She was enrolled at Cowley College as a pre-pharmacy student, a serious academic path that spoke to her discipline and her desire to build something meaningful with her life. But beyond the textbooks and the lecture halls, it was dancing that made her come fully alive. She was a proud member of the Cowley College Tigerette dance team, a group of young women who trained rigorously and performed with precision, bringing color and life to an otherwise plain Kansas winter. Jodie did not dance to be seen. She danced because she loved it, because the movement gave shape to something inside her that words alone could not reach. She was a daughter first and foremost. Her parents, Brian and Cindy Sanderholm, knew Jodie as someone warm and present. On the morning of January 5th, 2007, Cindy saw her daughter for what would be the last time, lying awake in her bed, lazily petting the family cat. It was an ordinary, unhurried moment, the kind that only becomes precious in retrospect, when memory searches desperately for something to hold on to. Jodie had dance practice that day, as she did regularly, and she left the house with no reason for anyone to feel worried. She was, after all, just going to college. What none of them knew, what Jodie herself may not have fully understood, was that for years she had been watched. Justin Thurber was 23 years old at the time, a young man from the same community, who carried within him a pattern of behavior that those who knew him would later describe as disturbing in the clearest possible terms. He was a bully by many accounts, aggressive, erratic, capable of making people deeply uncomfortable without ever quite crossing a line that would get him arrested. He had a history with women that should have raised alarms long before January 2007. A former girlfriend had sought a restraining order against him, stating that he followed her and sent her incessant, unwanted messages. 2 other members of the Tigerette dance team would later testify that he had stalked them as well. But in a small town, troubling behavior can go quietly unremarked upon for a very long time, especially when it never quite rises to the level of a formal complaint. Thurber had been watching Jodie, spying on her, for at least 6 years. 6 years. That means when Jodie was barely a teenager, just beginning to find out who she was, Justin Thurber had already fixed his gaze upon her. He had watched her grow up. He had attended or observed the same events she attended, moved through the same social spaces, built an obsession in the dark corners of his mind, while she moved through the world entirely unaware of the shadow she had acquired. The gap between her ordinary life and the threat that existed at its edges was not a crack. It was a chasm she never knew she was standing next to. On January 5th, 2007, Jodie attended her regular Tigerette dance practice at Cowley College. At some point during the day, around noon, she called home to tell her family she was heading back to the house to clean up. It was a normal, routine call. She was coming home. There was no urgency in her voice, no tension. Just a daughter letting her family know she'd be back soon. She never arrived. After practice, Jodie returned to her car and made her way toward her neighborhood. She stopped at her mailbox, a brief, automatic habit, the kind of small task that fills 100 ordinary afternoons. And it was in that vulnerable, unguarded moment that everything changed. Justin Thurber, who had followed her from the college, launched what prosecutors would describe as a blitz attack. He grabbed her suddenly and forcibly shoved her into her own car. She had no time to react, no time to call for help. One moment she was reaching for her mail. The next, her world had been violently stolen from her. Thurber drove her car away from the neighborhood, away from any possibility of rescue, toward the Cowley County State Lake and the surrounding wildlife area. A rural stretch of land where the isolation of the Kansas landscape worked against her and for him. What happened to Jodie in those final hours was confirmed later by evidence and autopsy, and it was horrific. She was raped. She was beaten. She suffered blunt force trauma and was ultimately strangled to death. The medical examiner's report noted that she had been dragged approximately 30 feet from the car to where she was eventually found. But Jodie did not go quietly. Beneath her fingernails, investigators would later find skin, biological material collected in one last act of raw, desperate resistance. She had fought back. In the darkest moment of her short life, she fought. That detail would become one of the most quietly important facts in the entire case. After her death, Thurber disposed of her car by driving it into the lake, submerging it in the cold January water, and left her body in a nearby wooded area. Then he went home, and when his parents tried to reach him throughout that afternoon, he did not answer. He finally called them back around 6 in the evening. Back at the Sanderholm home, the hours ticked by with growing dread. The shower was dry. There were no dirty clothes. The house had the particular, terrible stillness of a place that was supposed to be lived in but wasn't. Cindy and Brian Sanderholm waited through the afternoon, holding on to the hope that there was some simple explanation. A friend's house, a forgotten plan, a dead phone battery. Just after 6 in the evening, that hope collapsed, and they called the police. What followed was a massive community search effort. Arkansas City and the surrounding area rallied around the Sanderholm family with the instinctive solidarity that defines small towns in crisis. Volunteers combed the land, search teams were organized, and a wave of anguished hope swept through Cowley County. Texas X Search, a nationally known search and recovery organization, joined the effort. The town prayed and searched and refused for several days to give up. Investigators, meanwhile, moved quickly on a different front. On January 6th, just one day after Jodie disappeared, authorities identified Justin Thurber as a suspect. His history of stalking behavior, his proximity to the Tigerette dance team, and his erratic past made him someone who could not be ignored. The case against him began to build before anyone had even found Jodie. On January 9, 2007, divers searching Cowley County State Lake found what they had feared: Jodie's car submerged beneath the surface. It was a devastating discovery, confirmation that something deeply wrong had happened. Shortly after, Jodie's body was located in a wooded area nearby. She was found without clothing, her body bearing the marks of the violence she had endured. Personal items belonging to her were recovered from a chemical toilet at a fishing lake in the area, discarded evidence of what had been done to her. The identification of her body was made through dental records. The autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. Strangulation was the cause of death, accompanied by evidence of blunt force trauma and sexual assault. The community that had searched with hope was now united in grief. When the DNA collected from beneath Jodie's fingernails was processed and run through the database, it returned a match to Justin Thurber. The skin she had clawed from her attacker in her final, furious moments had named him. Science had done what witnesses and records alone might not have been enough to do. It had bound him irrevocably to the crime. Thurber was charged with capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, rape, and aggravated sodomy. The breadth of the charges reflected the full horror of what Jodie had endured and the calculated, predatory nature of what Thurber had done. Prosecutors characterized him not as a troubled young man who had made a terrible choice, but as a man who had spent years building toward this violence. A ticking time bomb, in their words, who had finally detonated. The trial began on February 2nd, 2009, 2 years after Jodie's death. In those 2 years, the Sanderholm family had lived in a state of suspended suffering, grieving deeply while waiting for the legal process to give them something they could hold on to. The courtroom in Winfield, the Cowley County seat, became the arena where the full scope of Justin Thurber's behavior was laid bare before a jury. Prosecutor Vic Braden delivered a 90-minute opening statement that walked jurors through the architecture of Thurber's obsession. The years of watching, the pattern of harassment toward multiple women, the DNA, the physical evidence, the disposal of the car, the hiding of the body. Witness after witness took the stand to fill in the contours of who Thurber was. Former members of the dance team described the creeping, persistent discomfort of knowing they were being watched. His former girlfriend described the harassment that had driven her to seek legal protection. Justin Swartzel testified to the years of surveillance directed at Jodie herself. Thurber's defense team attempted to paint a different picture. They introduced evidence of his bipolar disorder and argued that he had an intellectual disability that should have been considered as a mitigating factor in sentencing. The state had a legal threshold for determining intellectual disability, and Thurber's IQ score fell 10 points above it. The defense's argument, while legally obligatory, struggled against the weight of evidence. The planning, the disposal of evidence, the years of coordinated stalking behavior all pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had been building toward it for a very long time. On February 17, 2009, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. The recommendation was death. When the verdict was read, Thurber, apparently suddenly aware of what awaited him, made a last-ditch attempt to negotiate. Through his attorney, he offered to plead guilty if the death sentence were taken off the table. The Sanderholm family, who had sat through every hour of that trial carrying the weight of what they knew, declined. Justin Thurber was sentenced to death. But in the years that followed, the case did not end so cleanly. Thurber launched a series of legal appeals that have stretched on for well over a decade, pulling the Sanderholm family back repeatedly to a wound that could not fully heal. In 2021, the Kansas Supreme Court granted him the right to pursue DNA testing as part of his appeal. A subsequent hearing in June 2023 left a final decision pending. And in January 2026, nearly 19 years after Jodie's death, the Kansas Supreme Court heard arguments in the case once again, with Thurber still fighting his sentence from death row. It is a painful irony that Kansas has not carried out an execution since 1965. Thurber sits on death row in a state that sentences people to die but has for 60 years not followed through. Whether that changes, and whether the Sanderholm family ever witnesses a final legal conclusion to their daughter's murder, remains, as of this writing, an open question. What is not open to question is the mark Jodie Sanderholm left on the world. In the wake of her death, Kansas lawmakers moved to close the legal gaps that had allowed a stalker to operate for years without meaningful consequence. The result was Jodie's Law, a landmark anti-stalking statute that strengthened the state's definition of stalking and significantly increased the penalties for those who engage in it. It was the kind of legislation that should not require a death to be passed, but it exists now carrying her name because she died and because the people who loved her refused to let that death mean nothing. Jodie Sanderholm was 19 years old. She was studying to become a pharmacist. She danced. She called home at noon to say she was on her way. She reached for her mail on an ordinary winter afternoon and never made it through the front door. She fought, in the end, with everything she had, and the evidence of that fight, the skin beneath her nails, helped ensure that the man who killed her would never be free again. In Arkansas City, people still know her name. They know it not only because of what was done to her, but because of who she was before any of it happened. A young woman with a future, a daughter petting a cat in the morning light, a dancer in love with the feeling of movement. The law that bears her name reaches forward into a future she never got to see, quietly doing the work of keeping others safe, in the only way the living can honor the dead. Her name was Jodie. She mattered. She still does. Story 5. The roads in deep East Texas have a particular quality in the last hours of the night, narrow, tree-lined, and swallowed by a darkness so complete that the stars overhead seem almost intrusive. In the tiny town of Hemphill, tucked into Sabine County, near the Louisiana border, people know each other by name, by family, by the sound of a truck engine pulling into a driveway. It is the kind of place where secrets do not stay secret for long. And yet, on the morning of October 31st, 2020, Halloween, a 19-year-old girl was dying on the side of one of those dark roads, and nobody came for over an hour. Her name was Libby Lewis. Most people who loved her called her Libby. She was 19 years old, with a life that was still being written, still in the early pages, still full of the kind of ordinary brightness that young women carry before the world gets its hands on them. She had friends who laughed too loudly with her, family who adored her, and a future that stretched forward like one of those long Texas roads, seeming to go on forever. On the night of October 30th, she dressed up for a Halloween party, the way millions of young Americans do every year, in every small town, without a single thought of consequence. She had no reason to think that night would be different from any other. The party was being hosted by a man named Bobby Ozan, a friend in the Hemphill social circle. It was casual, the way those gatherings are, music and drinks and the particular warmth that comes from being around familiar people. Libby was there. So was Montana Bockel, a young woman who had once been married to a man named Matthew Edgar, Libby's ex-boyfriend, and who had, somewhat unusually, remained friends with Libby even after things with Edgar ended. The two women were close enough to spend the evening together, talking and laughing and largely ignoring the tension that hovered at the edge of the gathering, unannounced, like smoke before a fire. Matthew Edgar was 23 years old, and he had arrived at that party carrying something that did not belong in any celebration, a jealousy so raw and corrosive that it had already bent the shape of his behavior for weeks. He and Libby had been together, and then they had not been together, and Edgar had never fully adjusted to the distance between those two realities. He watched her that night, not with the wistfulness of a person learning to let go, but with the hardening gaze of a person who had decided he would not. He drank heavily. He worked through an entire bottle of whiskey over the course of that long evening, and as the alcohol settled into his bloodstream, whatever restraint he had left began to dissolve. It was past 2 in the morning when the night began to fracture. Most of the guests had gone home. Only Libby and Montana remained at Bobby Ozan's house, and at some point during those quiet late hours, Edgar got wind of something that ignited a fury in him. Libby was apparently going to spend the rest of the night at Ozan's house. Whether it was the thought of her choosing to stay somewhere he was not, or the suspicion of what that might mean, or simply the pure combustion of jealousy meeting alcohol, something in Edgar broke open. He came back to Ozan's house. He found Montana and turned his rage on her, physically attacking her and kicking her car, apparently blaming her for not preventing whatever he believed was happening between Libby and Ozan. Bobby Ozan stepped in and tried to restrain him. It gave the two women just enough time to escape. Montana fled to Edgar's grandparents' home nearby, one of those instinctive choices people make in a crisis, running toward the familiar even when the familiar is complicated. Libby got into her car and drove. Where she was going is unclear. Perhaps home. Perhaps nowhere in particular, just away from the tension and the heat of the moment. She drove into the dark Texas night, alone, and at some point on a road outside Hemphill she stopped. Libby had pulled her car to the side of the road and sat with her legs crossed, her posture relaxed and open. She was not braced for an attack. She was not reaching for anything or preparing to flee. She looked like someone who had chosen to stop, someone who was comfortable with whoever was approaching her vehicle. That detail is one of the most heartbreaking in the entire case, because what it means is this. When Matthew Edgar came for her, she did not see him as a threat. She saw him as someone she knew, someone she had once loved. She stopped her car and waited for him, not because she was unaware of danger, but because she did not believe that danger was what he was bringing. She was wrong. At 3:34 in the morning, Montana Bockel was sitting at Edgar's grandparents' home, her nerves still raw from the chaos at Ozan's house. She sent Edgar a text message asking where Libby was. It was a simple question, the kind a friend sends when the night has gone sideways and someone is unaccounted for. A message born of worry and the instinct to locate the people you care about. Edgar's reply was a single word. Dead. He typed it and sent it at 3:34 in the morning, long before any 911 call had been made, long before any passerby had discovered the car on the side of the road, long before Libby's mother had been told anything was wrong. He sent that word in a text message to his ex-wife, casually, as though it were a weather update. The word would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. A timestamp, a confession, and a window into the mind of a man who had done something irreversible and was already treating it as a fact of life. The rifle was found in the grass near Libby's car. It was Matthew Edgar's rifle. A bullet fragment recovered from inside the vehicle matched the weapon. Libby Lewis had been shot once in the neck, and she had died sitting in her own car, in a posture of calm and trust, on a dark road in the county where she grew up. At approximately 5:15 in the morning, a stranger driving past noticed the car on the side of the road and stopped to check. What she found was a scene she would not forget. A young woman draped over the steering wheel, with no pulse. The stranger called 911. Emergency responders arrived at the scene, and not long after, they found something else nearby. Matthew Edgar was lying on the ground in a fetal position, directly behind Libby's car. He was bloodied. His rifle was in the grass. He was alive, and when first responders reached him, he was disoriented and confused. He was loaded into an ambulance and taken to the hospital. At the hospital, investigator J.P. McDonough sat beside Edgar's hospital bed with a body camera rolling. What followed was a conversation that would later be shown to a jury, frame by frame, and it was one of the strangest and most revealing exchanges of the entire investigation. Edgar was lying in bed, and McDonough began asking him questions, simple, direct questions. When did you last see Libby? Tonight. How did you end up on the ground behind her car? I don't know. You don't know how you ended up on the ground, behind the car, with the dead girl in it? No, sir. I have no clue. Edgar's claim was that he remembered almost nothing. He said he had been drinking, the entire bottle of whiskey, and that the last thing he recalled was falling asleep on his porch. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the ambulance. He said it plainly, without panic, without the shaking urgency of a man who had just experienced something traumatic. He claimed he did not know his own rifle had been fired. He claimed he did not know Libby was dead. And when McDonough told him she was gone, Edgar appeared to cry. McDonough watched that performance and made a decision. Before Edgar ever left the hospital bed, the investigator arrested him for the murder of Libby Lewis. At 7:30 in the morning, a woman arrived at the crime scene and broke the stillness of the autumn morning with a grief so absolute it silenced everyone around her. Darcy Bass had gotten a call from a friend. Something had happened to her daughter. She had driven to the scene immediately, and what met her when she arrived was a wall of law enforcement officers, yellow tape, and a reluctance to answer the one question she needed answered. She asked at least 23 times where her daughter was. 23 times. The body cam footage captured every one of them, her voice rising with each repetition, fractured and desperate, a mother trying to break through official process with the sheer force of love and terror. Finally, when officers told her that Libby was in the car, something in Darcy Bass collapsed. She dropped to the ground. Her knees gave out, and she went down to the earth like the weight of the news was a physical thing, a force pressing down on her, demanding she yield. The footage of that moment became one of the most devastating pieces of testimony the case would ever produce, and it was testimony that required no words. For a time, in the strange pause that followed the arrest, the case against Edgar stalled. The COVID-19 pandemic had shut down courts across Texas, and grand juries were not being convened. Texas law required that a person who had been arrested, but not yet formally indicted by a grand jury, be allowed to post bail if he had been held long enough. Matthew Edgar walked out of custody and back into the streets of Hemphill, the same small town where Libby's mother lived, where Libby's friends still gathered, where the wound of what he had allegedly done was still raw and open. On December 16, 2021, more than a year after her daughter's murder, Darcy Bass walked into her local convenience store for what should have been an ordinary errand. And there, coming through the door, was Matthew Edgar, the man charged with killing her child. Walking freely, looking at her, she did not calculate what happened next. She did not plan it. When he came in the door, she would later say, "I just went, started throwing whatever at him, and went for him." She followed him into the parking lot, grabbed a length of chain from the bed of his truck, and swung it against his windshield. Edgar called the sheriff's office. He filed a complaint. Darcy Bass was charged with assault, retaliation, and criminal mischief. An arrest warrant was issued in her name. She turned herself in. The charges were eventually dropped, but the spectacle of a grieving mother being charged with a crime for confronting the man accused of murdering her daughter was not lost on anyone who followed the case, and it crystallized for many people what the long period of waiting, the bail, the delays, the pandemic-driven pause in justice, had cost this family in terms of peace, safety, and sanity. On March 16, 2021, a grand jury finally convened and heard the evidence against Edgar. They indicted him for murder. He remained out on bail as the case moved toward trial, wearing an electronic ankle monitor that was meant to ensure he could not simply vanish. The trial was scheduled and delayed, scheduled again and delayed again, in the way that serious criminal trials often are when defense attorneys and prosecutors negotiate the 1,000 procedural details that precede the courtroom. When the trial finally began in January 2022, Darcy Bass was ready. She had been ready for over a year. She had put up wanted posters, handed them out at flea markets, taped them to store windows. She had done the work that she felt the system was too slow to do. Now at last, strangers were going to sit and listen to what had happened to her child. The first 2 days of testimony were powerful. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the party, the jealous rage, the attack on Montana, the escape of the two women, and then the text message. That single word, dead, sent at 3:34 in the morning before any police officer had spoken to anyone, before any 911 call, before the world even knew Libby Lewis was dying on the side of a road. Prosecutors presented the rifle. They presented the bullet fragment recovered from inside the car. They presented the body cam footage of Edgar in the hospital, claiming amnesia, claiming innocence, staring at the ceiling while the investigator watched him with the patient certainty of a man who already knew the truth. And then the prosecution presented the detail that brought everything into sharp, terrible focus. A tiny drop of Libby Lewis's blood, found on Matthew Edgar's pants. DNA testing confirmed it was hers. Defense attorney Rob Hughes argued during cross-examination that there was no way to know how long the blood had been there or how it got there. That absence of fingerprints on the rifle and absence of DNA on the trigger were meaningful gaps. But the prosecution had built a case not on a single piece of evidence, but on the architecture of many. The text, the rifle, the blood, the timeline, the rage at the party, the missing memory, the 3:34 timestamp of a word no innocent man would have sent. On the third day of testimony, Matthew Edgar did not show up to his own trial. His attorney received a phone call from Edgar's mother, Cindy Hogan, who said her son was nowhere to be found. Investigators checked the ankle monitor. Its battery had been allowed to run down, the signal going dark, and Edgar had walked away from his family home and vanished into the East Texas landscape. The judge made the decision that trials in Texas are legally allowed to continue in a defendant's absence, and so the proceedings moved forward. The jury heard the rest of the evidence. The jury deliberated, and without Matthew Edgar sitting at the defense table to look the jurors in the eye and deny what he had done, they returned a verdict. Guilty. But Edgar was gone. The verdict was meaningless without a body to attach the sentence to, and Edgar had become a fugitive, a convicted murderer running from the justice he had already fled once, in the hours after he killed Libby Lewis, before anyone even knew she was gone. Darcy Bass, who had waited years for this day, found herself waiting again. She went back to the streets, back to the flyers and the posters and the conversations with strangers in parking lots, telling anyone who would listen that the man who killed her daughter was still out there. "I thought he was just going to get away," she would later say. "And nobody was looking, and I was having to make wanted posters and go hand them out at the flea markets." People told her to take the posters down from store windows. She put them back up. For 11 months, Edgar hid. He hid somewhere close to home, as criminals so often do. Not in a distant city, not across state lines, but practically within sight of the place where he had grown up. U.S. Marshals, working with the Sabine County Sheriff's Office and Texas Parks and Wildlife Game Wardens, tracked him down on December 29, 2022. When they found him, he was in a house that belonged to a family friend, a house just yards from his grandparents' home, just yards from the same stretch of hemp hill that Libby Lewis had grown up in, just yards from the road where she had died trusting someone she should never have trusted again. His mother, Cindy Hogan, was found in the same house. On January 3, 2023, Matthew Edgar appeared before a judge and received the sentence a jury had decided over a year earlier. 99 years in prison. The possibility of parole after 30 years. He was in his mid-20s. If he serves the minimum, he will not be free until his mid-50s, if ever. The judge read the sentence while Edgar stood in a courtroom in Sabine County, Texas. The same county where he had attended that Halloween party, where he had driven in the dark with a rifle, where he had sent a single word at 3:34 in the morning that told everyone who needed to know exactly what he had done. Darcy Bass had spent over 2 years in motion, fighting, searching, grieving, demanding, waiting, confronting, and refusing to accept that the world had moved on from her daughter. The verdict had been read in her absence. The sentencing came with her presence. She had been there for every step of the long road between finding her daughter dead in a car and watching the man who killed her receive a consequence for it. Whether any sentence, whether any number of years assigned to the life of a person still breathing, constitutes justice for a life that ended in the dark, that is not a question the law answers. It is the question that remains, the one Darcy Bass lives with every day in the same small Texas town where her daughter grew up and died. Libby Lewis was 19 years old. She had dressed up for Halloween. She had spent the night laughing with a friend, navigating the complicated social landscape that all young people know. The ex-boyfriends, the awkward parties, the quiet work of moving on. She had gotten into her car and driven away from chaos. And when someone she used to love pulled up alongside her on a dark road, she did what people do when they have not yet learned that danger can wear a familiar face. She stopped. She stayed calm. She waited, with her legs crossed and her hands still, in the posture of a person who is not afraid. She was 19 years old, and she deserved the rest of her life. Story 6. The house on Castle Ridge Boulevard looked like any other on its street, modest, quiet, tucked into the northeastern corner of Calgary, Alberta, where the prairie wind blows cold and steady and neighbors rarely ask questions. It was the kind of neighborhood where life moved at its own unhurried pace. School buses in the mornings, dogs walked at dusk, weekend barbecues spilling laughter into the cool Canadian air. No one would have guessed that inside one of those ordinary homes, a young woman had spent the last hours of her life alone, and that those hours would become one of the most haunting, unanswered questions in the city's modern history. Amanda Antony was 31 years old in the autumn of 2015. By every account, she was a warm, vivid young woman, the kind of person whose presence could light up a room without effort. She lived in the Castle Ridge home with her husband, Lee Antony, and their dog, Ruby, a gentle animal who followed her everywhere. Amanda and Lee had built a life together in that house, the kind of life that is unremarkable in the best possible way: ordinary routines, shared meals, plans for the future. There was nothing in the days leading up to the weekend of October 24th that would have caused anyone alarm. Lee was going away for the weekend, driving east into Saskatchewan to help his mother settle his late father's affairs. It was a duty-bound trip, the kind any caring son would make. He kissed Amanda goodbye, and Amanda was left alone in the house with Ruby. Saturday, October 24th, 2015, arrived gray and cooled the way Calgary autumns often do. Amanda went about her day in the quiet of an empty house. There is no record of trouble, no indication that she had fears or worries pressing on her that day. She was simply a young woman spending a weekend alone, waiting for her husband to come home. Then, at 7:06 in the evening, Lee called her from Saskatchewan. It was the kind of call couples make during time apart, routine, comforting, brief. They talked, and then, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, something changed. Ruby, who had been calm as always, suddenly began to bark and yelp, sharply and with unmistakable urgency. It was a sound Lee had never heard from the dog before. Amanda's voice may have shifted, it is impossible to say now, but before Lee could ask what was wrong, the call went dead. The line disconnected from Amanda's end. Lee waited. He called back. There was no answer. He likely told himself it was nothing, a neighbor's cat outside the window, some startled moment that would resolve itself. He may have tried again, or assumed Amanda had simply gone to bed. What Lee could not have known, what he would not discover until 2 days later, was that the world on the other side of that phone call had already changed irrevocably. Amanda Antony never picked up the phone again. Monday, October 26, 2015. Lee Antony pulled into the driveway of the Castle Ridge home in the mid-afternoon, tired from his long drive back from Saskatchewan, and perhaps a little relieved to be home. It was 3:45 in the afternoon. He walked into the house, expecting to find Amanda, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps watching television, perhaps upstairs. What he found instead was silence. And then, when he descended toward the basement, he found something that no human being should ever have to find. Amanda was lying at the bottom of the basement stairs, motionless, cold to the touch. There was blood, an enormous, horrifying amount of blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, on Amanda herself. Her face was barely recognizable. Lee Antony screamed. He called 911 in absolute hysterics, his voice breaking apart with panic and grief, barely able to string words together to describe the scene he was witnessing. When Calgary police and paramedics arrived at the Antony home, the sight that greeted them stopped even seasoned investigators cold. Several of the detectives who would later work the case admitted that they had never, in their entire careers, encountered a scene quite as gruesome as the Antony basement. Amanda was found in a position that paramedics and investigators immediately recognized as inconsistent with natural death. She was cold, she had been dead for some time, and the quantity of blood surrounding her suggested violence of a terrible and sustained nature. The house itself told a story, or the beginning of one. On the main floor, police noticed that a chair had been knocked over, lying sideways on the ground as though it had been struck or pushed in a moment of chaos. More unnervingly, Amanda's phone was discovered on the hallway floor, several feet away from the entrance to the basement. Not dropped near the stairs, not resting in a logical place, but lying alone in the middle of the hallway, as if it had fallen during a struggle or been knocked from her hand. At the top of the basement stairs, investigators found the shattered remains of a ceramic piggy bank. The object had been struck or smashed with considerable force, and ceramic shards from it were later found scattered across the floor around Amanda's body. The basement itself, sealed and dark, had apparently been the site of unimaginable suffering. The case was immediately assigned to the homicide unit, not because murder had been confirmed, but because everything about the scene demanded the most serious possible investigation. In the world of criminal investigation, the first suspect in any suspicious death is always the person closest to the victim. This is not cynicism, it is statistical reality and investigative protocol. And so, even as Lee Anthony sat in a state of visible shock and grief, detectives began the quiet and painstaking work of tracing his every movement over the past 48 hours. Lee cooperated fully. He told investigators where he had gone, what roads he had taken, where he had stopped for fuel. He provided phone records. He gave them everything they asked for without hesitation. And when detectives began combing through gas station surveillance footage along the route from Calgary to Saskatchewan and back, what they found was a precise, consistent, and unbroken record of Lee's movements. A documented trail that placed him irrefutably away from Calgary at the estimated time of Amanda's death. Investigators could not find a single gap in that timeline, not a single moment in which Lee could have been present in that basement. They also found no evidence that he had communicated with anyone who could have acted on his behalf, no trace of an arranged conspiracy, no indication of infidelity on either side of the marriage that might have provided a motive. Lee Anthony was ruled out as a suspect, but this cleared path opened onto something far more unsettling. If Lee had not done this, and if no one close to Amanda was implicated, then who had been in that basement? The autopsy results arrived in December 2015, 6 weeks after Amanda's body was discovered, and they painted a picture of terrible suffering. The chief medical examiner's findings were unsparing. Amanda Anthony had sustained blunt force trauma to her face, her head, her back, her buttocks, and her extremities. She had extensive bruising and abrasions across her body. There was a laceration on her face. Her nasal bone had been fractured. Her right orbital bone, the delicate ridge of bone that surrounds the eye, had been broken. Cannabis was detected in her system, consistent with casual use rather than incapacitation. And yet, amid all of this damage, there were two findings that made investigators pause. Amanda had sustained no brain injury. Her skull had not cracked. For investigators and medical professionals, this was unexpected. When a person is beaten to death, particularly with enough force to cause the volume of bleeding found at the scene, brain trauma and skull fracture are almost universal outcomes. Their absence was puzzling. The official cause of death was determined to be loss of blood resulting from blunt force trauma. Amanda had bled out. She had not been rendered immediately unconscious. She had, in all likelihood, been alive and in tremendous pain for some period of time after the injuries began. Perhaps aware, perhaps not, perhaps fading in and out of consciousness on that cold basement floor while the house above her stayed silent. She was not found to have been sexually assaulted. The question of what, or who, inflicted those injuries remained deeply, maddeningly open. As the investigation deepened through the winter of 2015 and into 2016, detectives turned their attention to the neighborhood. They spoke with Amanda's neighbors, people who had watched her come and go in the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Two pieces of information from those conversations stood out. One neighbor reported hearing a commotion from inside the Anthony home around the same time that Lee and Amanda's phone call had disconnected, around 7 o'clock or 7:10 in the evening on Saturday. The sound had been notable enough to register, though not alarming enough at the time to prompt action. A second neighbor, perhaps more chillingly, reported having seen a figure running across the lawns near the Anthony property in the darkness of that same Saturday evening. These were not conclusive pieces of evidence. Neighbors' memories are fragile things, especially when recalling something that seemed unremarkable at the time. The figure in the dark could have been anyone, a jogger, a teenager, someone walking a pet. But taken alongside the overturned chair, the phone lying on the hallway floor, and the severed phone call punctuated by a dog's terrified yelping, the testimony painted an unsettling picture. Ruby, the dog who had yelped so desperately on that Saturday call, was found upstairs when police arrived on Monday. She had not gone near the basement. For a dog devoted to her owner, this was a detail that lingered. Animals follow their instincts, and Ruby's instinct had been to stay away from whatever was in that basement. Forensic investigators worked the scene with meticulous care. They searched for fingerprints, for shoe impressions, for hair fibers and skin cells and DNA traces. Any biological material that could not be accounted for by Amanda herself. What they found after all of that work was nothing. No DNA from an unknown person. No foreign fingerprints. No footwear impressions in the blood that might have belonged to someone other than Amanda. The forensic scene was, in the language of investigation, eerily clean. This was the paradox at the heart of the case. The scene was, in one sense, impossibly violent, too violent, most detectives believed, for a simple accident. And yet it was also impossibly clean, too devoid of forensic trace to support a murder. In December 2016, after more than a year of investigation, the Calgary Police Service announced its official ruling on the death of Amanda Antony. The conclusion was not the one Amanda's family had hoped for, nor the one that sat comfortably with the detectives who had worked the case. Amanda Antony's death was ruled an accident. The theory offered was grim in its simplicity. Amanda had been near the top of the basement stairs when something caused her to lose her balance. Perhaps she tripped over Ruby. Perhaps she slipped. Perhaps she turned too quickly in the dark. She struck the ceramic piggy bank with enough force to shatter it against her head, fracturing her orbital bone and nasal bone, and then fell down the stairs into the basement below. Once there, on the cold concrete floor, she bled out slowly from her injuries. The overturned chair and the phone on the floor were explained as results of her fall and the struggle to catch herself. The dog's bark on the phone call was the moment it happened. A team of expert behavioral scientists, brought in to analyze the scene with fresh eyes, came to the same conclusion. It was, they acknowledged, an extraordinarily rare and tragic outcome, the kind of accident that almost never happens but statistically does. The absence of any third-party forensic trace made alternative explanations nearly impossible to substantiate. Yet the official ruling did not close the wound. It could not. Amanda's family refused to accept it. For them, the woman they had known, careful, aware of her surroundings, living in her own home, would not simply fall to her death from an accidental stumble. The severity of her injuries, the breadth of the bruising across her body, the yelp of a terrified dog, the figure seen running in the dark, none of it felt like an accident. It felt like something that was being left unanswered because the answers were too difficult to find. The lead detective on Amanda's case, even after the official ruling was issued, continued to work informally on behalf of the Antony family. It was an unusual and quietly remarkable choice. A law enforcement professional who could not let go of a case that had been officially closed, who understood that official closure is not the same as truth. In the years that followed, the Amanda Antony case settled into the cold and frustrating category of cases that refused to be forgotten. It generated no arrest, no trial, no convicted perpetrator, no definitive answers. The figure seen running across the lawns was never identified. The commotion heard by neighbors was never explained. The reason Ruby yelped, and then fell silent, and then waited upstairs for 2 days beside an empty house, was never understood. Calgary police used the renewed attention to make a public appeal. If anyone had seen anything on the evening of Saturday, October 24th, 2015, in the Castle Ridge neighborhood, anything at all, they were urged to come forward. Anonymously, if necessary. The case number was still active. No decisive tips emerged. The death of Amanda Antony resists the neat endings that we, as human beings, need from stories like this. We want perpetrators to be named and punished. We want evidence to arrange itself into clarity. We want the people left behind to receive something that resembles justice, or at least the relief of knowing. Amanda Antony gave none of those things. What it gave instead was a reminder of how much can be taken and left unexplained. A young woman of 31, loved, living an ordinary life in an ordinary home, was dead within minutes of a phone call that ended with her dog crying out in the dark. Her husband spent 48 hours driving back toward a life that no longer existed in the form he had left it. Investigators gave months and years of work to a basement that surrendered nothing. A family sat with an official ruling that felt like a door closed in their face. Somewhere in the story of Amanda Antony, Between the overturned chair and the shattered piggy bank, between the disconnected phone call and the silent dog, there may be a truth that has not yet been spoken aloud. Whether it ever will be is the question that keeps the case alive in the minds of those who know it, and in the grief of those who loved her. Amanda Antony deserved answers. She still does. Story 7. The August air in Austin, Texas, hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of heat that promised no relief, even as the sun began its slow descent. For Jennifer Ray Cave, however, the oppressive summer of 2005 was a season of hope. At 21, she was a young woman on the cusp of a new beginning, a fresh start she desperately needed. Jennifer had the kind of infectious enthusiasm that drew people to her, a bright, bubbly personality that masked a deeper vulnerability. She had moved to Austin with dreams of a college degree, enrolling at Texas State University in San Marcos, but the academic world had proven to be a poor fit. She dropped out after a single semester, a detour that left her adrift in a city that could be as unforgiving as it was exciting. She'd taken jobs as a waitress, navigating the transient world of Austin's service industry, while briefly attending community college. But Jennifer was battling more than just academic uncertainty. Her friends and family were aware of her struggle with drugs, a recurring fight between her desire for a stable life and the pull of a darker, more chaotic scene. Now finally, a real opportunity had emerged from the haze. On August 16th, she had walked into a local law firm for what was meant to be a one-day filing job. She had thrown herself into the work with such gusto that by the end of the day, they had offered her a full-time position as a legal assistant, a steady job with a real future. That evening, she was buzzing with excitement. She called her mother, Sharon, her roommate, and her ex-boyfriend, her voice brimming with the promise of this new chapter. At 8:30 p.m., she was in her pajamas, ready for an early night, so she'd be fresh for her first official day. "Make sure I wake up in the morning," she told her roommate, a simple request that would later be imbued with a tragic irony. But the quiet night she had planned was not to be. Around 9:30 p.m., she spoke to a friend, Michael Rodriguez, and told him she was going to see a friend named Colton, who was having some problems. That friend was Colton Aaron Pataniak, a 22-year-old junior at the prestigious University of Texas. On the surface, Colton was the picture of success. A National Merit Scholar from a private Catholic high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, he had come to UT on a scholarship, admitted to the competitive business school. He was handsome, clean-cut, and from a respectable upper-middle-class family. But behind the polished facade was a young man spiraling into a world of drug and alcohol abuse. His family knew of his struggles, but they didn't know the extent of it, that he was not just using, but dealing, and that his life was becoming increasingly unmoored. The relationship between Jennifer and Colton was ill-defined. They weren't a couple, not in any traditional sense. To her friends, he was primarily her source for drugs, a connection to a world she was trying to leave behind. That night, however, he was a friend in need, and Jennifer, ever the loyal friend, decided to go to him. Their night began on Austin's infamous 6th Street, the city's throbbing heart of bars and live music. They met up with some of Jennifer's acquaintances at a bar called Treasure Island, the group sharing a few drinks at a table. While Jennifer chatted with her girlfriends, Colton was on his phone, setting up a deal for drugs. Around midnight, the group decided to move on to another bar, Cheers Shot Bar. But at the door, Colton pulled Jennifer aside. The two of them were last seen walking away together, disappearing into the humid Austin night. A little after midnight, Jennifer called Michael Rodriguez. She told him that the only people who could help Colton were in jail. She didn't sound scared or anxious, just matter of fact. She said she would call him back. An hour later, she called again. This time, her voice was strained. She described Colton as drunk and angry. Michael could hear her yelling in the background. "What are you doing? That is not my car." And then, "Oh my God, he is pissing on that car." Still, she didn't ask for help. She didn't sound like she was in danger. It was the last time anyone, other than her killer, would hear her voice. Sometime between that last phone call, at 1:05 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., inside Colton Pataniak's apartment at the Orange Tree Condominiums in West Campus, Jennifer Cave was murdered. It was, as a prosecutor would later describe it, a very clean murder. A single bullet from a .380 Smith & Wesson handgun was fired through her right arm, traveled into her chest, and tore through her heart, killing her almost instantly. The act itself was swift, brutal, and final. But what happened next was a descent into a level of depravity that would shock even seasoned investigators. Alone in his apartment with Jennifer's lifeless body, Colton Petoniak did not panic in a way that might seem logical. He didn't call the police. He didn't run. Instead, he began a grotesque and methodical process of desecration. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted in a frenzy of post-mortem violence. He stabbed her body repeatedly in the chest and neck. Then, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, he began to dismember her. Her head and both of her hands were severed from her body. The prosecutor's words would later haunt the case. It was the post-murder behavior that made it so grotesque. The mutilation was anger. It wasn't any effort to hide the body or get rid of the body. It was just playing with it like it was a toy. In the early hours of the morning, his gruesome work still in progress, Colton went to the apartment of a neighbor, Nora Sullivan. He was rambling, telling a bizarre story about a gunfight with two Mexican men, claiming he'd fired 2 shots and might have hit someone. He showed her his gun, asked if he had blood on him. She saw a small smear on his arm. After leaving Nora's, he started sending text messages to Laura Ashley Hall. Laura was a fellow UT student who had once been Colton's girlfriend. Her feelings for him, however, ran much deeper and were far more obsessive than his for her. At 6 a.m., a 13-minute phone call connected them. Whatever was said in that call, it sealed Laura Hall's fate and tied her inextricably to the horrific events unfolding in Colton's apartment. Later that morning, as Jennifer's new colleagues at the law firm were wondering where their enthusiastic new hire was, Colton Petoniak was at Breed's Hardware, less than a mile from his apartment. He bought a hacksaw, safety masks, ammonia, and other cleaning supplies. He told the clerk he needed the saw to cut up a turkey he was frying. The surveillance video showed he was alone. On the way back to his apartment, he stopped at Burger King. Back in the apartment, the mutilation continued. The hacksaw he had just purchased was later found lying on Jennifer's abdomen. A final, chilling act of violence was committed. A bullet was fired into Jennifer's head through her severed neck. The next morning, August 17th, the law firm called Jennifer's mother, Sharon Cave, in Corpus Christi. Jennifer hadn't shown up for work. Sharon, who was extremely close to her daughter and spoke to her several times a day, felt a surge of panic. She immediately started calling Jennifer's friends. She reached Michael Rodriguez, who told her about the strange phone calls from the night before. Then, Colton Petoniak returned one of Sharon's calls. He was calm, casual, and he lied. He told her he hadn't seen Jennifer. Michael, still on the other line with Sharon, immediately told her that Colton was lying. The knot of fear in Sharon's stomach tightened. She and her fiancé, Jim Sedgwick, drove to Austin on August 18th. They went straight to the Orange Tree condominiums, where they found Jennifer's car parked outside. They banged on Colton's door, yelling for Jennifer, their voices swallowed by the indifferent city heat. The police arrived, but told the distraught family they couldn't enter the apartment without a warrant. As the police left, Jim Sedgwick, consumed by a desperate fear for Jennifer's safety, made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had managed to unlock a window earlier, and now he climbed through it, into the darkened apartment. The air inside was still and heavy with an odor of decay. He moved through the typical college male clutter, but the kitchen was immaculately clean. On the coffee table, he saw 2 shell casings. Then, he walked into the bathroom. What he saw in the bathtub would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. It was Jennifer, but it was a version of Jennifer so desecrated, so violated, that it was barely recognizable. Her body was in the tub, mutilated. Her head and hands had been placed in a garbage bag on the floor next to her. Jim didn't stay long enough to take in the full horror. He scrambled back out of the apartment and called 911 again. When Sharon tried to go inside, to see for herself, he had to physically restrain her, to protect her from the nightmare that lay within. While Jennifer's family was making their horrific discovery, Colton Petoniak and Laura Hall were already on the run. At 8:34 p.m. the previous night, Colton had spoken to Sharon Cave one last time, telling her he was eating pizza with my friends, and that she and the police should leave him alone. Immediately after that call, His cell phone records showed him traveling south on Interstate 35, on a clear path to the Mexican border. He and Laura crossed into Piedras Negras at 2:41 a.m. in her green Cadillac. For 5 days, they partied in Mexico. They went with the clerk of the Casablanca Hotel to watch an Ultimate Fighting Championship match. Colton, in a moment of chilling detachment, inquired about extradition laws and the possibility of selling Laura's car to travel deeper into Mexico. But their flight from justice was short-lived. Tips from Crime Stoppers led Mexican authorities to their hotel. On August 23rd, a Mexican SWAT team took them into custody. They were driven to the International Bridge at Eagle Pass, Texas, where U.S. Marshals were waiting. Colton Petaniak was arrested for the murder of Jennifer Cave. Laura Hall was, for the moment, allowed to go free. The trial of Colton Petaniak began in January 2007. The prosecution, led by Bill Bishop and Stephanie McFarland, made a strategic decision to charge him only with murder, not the lesser offenses of manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. They wanted to force the defense to explain what happened in that apartment in the early hours of August 17th. Colton's defense was that he had no memory of the murder. He testified that he had been on a days-long bender of drugs and alcohol, and that when he woke up, he found Jennifer's body in the bathtub. He admitted that he must have been the one who shot her, but he claimed it was Laura Hall who had orchestrated the dismemberment. He said she had made a list of items to buy from the hardware store, and that it was her idea to flee to Mexico. The prosecution countered by painting a picture of Colton as a man fascinated by the gangster lifestyle. They showed the jury his online screen names, Kmoney and Ill of Money Andos. They pointed to his favorite movies, Donnie Brasco and Goodfellas, both of which feature scenes of body dismemberment. In his apartment, police had found a Sopranos DVD in which a character dismembers a body in a bathtub. The large Scarface movie poster in his kitchen took on a new, sinister meaning. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before finding Colton Petaniak guilty of murder. After powerful and heart-wrenching testimony from Sharon Cave about the devastating impact of her daughter's murder, the jury sentenced him to 55 years in prison. Laura Hall's legal journey was more complex. In 2007, she was convicted of tampering with evidence and hindering apprehension for her role in the dismemberment and the flight to Mexico. She was sentenced to 5 years, a relatively light sentence that suggested the jury was divided on her level of culpability. But her legal troubles were not over. In 2010, she was resentenced and received the maximum possible term, 10 years for tampering with evidence and 1 year for hindering apprehension, to be served concurrently. Throughout her trials, Laura Hall's story changed repeatedly. At first, she claimed to know nothing, to have never even seen the body. Then, she said she had seen the body but didn't know what happened. Finally, she claimed she was a victim herself, kidnapped by Colton. But the evidence told a different story. Her DNA was found on the murder weapon and on a flip-flop in the bathroom. Witnesses, including a former cellmate, testified that Laura had made incriminating statements about her involvement, even boasting about the dismemberment and callously referring to Jennifer as nothing and nobody. Despite the convictions, a clear motive for the murder was never established. Why did Colton Petaniak, a promising young student, so brutally kill a woman he called a friend? And what was Laura Hall's true role in the horrific aftermath? Was she a lovesick young woman manipulated by a sociopath, as her defense attorney claimed, or was she a willing and cruel participant in the desecration of Jennifer Cave's body? The evidence was confounding, the testimonies contradictory. In the years that followed, the case of Jennifer Cave continued to haunt the Austin community and beyond. Colton Petaniak remains in prison, serving his 55-year sentence. Laura Hall was released on parole in 2018, her sentence completed. The case remains a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a placid surface, and the devastating, inexplicable violence that can erupt in a moment, extinguishing a bright young life and leaving a trail of shattered families and unanswered questions in its wake. Story 8. The quiet of a Michigan autumn had settled over Mayfield Township in November 2011. The trees had shed their fiery colors, leaving a stark, skeletal beauty against the gray sky. It was a time of transition, a slow slide into the deep sleep of winter. For 20-year-old Andrea Alber, it was a season of quiet responsibility. She was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle, a simple favor for family that placed her in a secluded home, surrounded by the rustling quiet of the Lapeer County countryside. She was a young woman on the cusp of her life, working at a local grocery store, navigating the joys and complexities of a serious relationship with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Kenneth Casey Grondin. Her world was small, familiar, and safe. Then, on November 14th, that world fractured. The calls and texts to Andrea's phone, once met with swift and cheerful replies, now vanished into an unnerving silence. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in the stomachs of her family and friends. It wasn't like her to be out of touch. KC, her devoted boyfriend, seemed particularly worried. The silence stretched from hours into a day, then another. The anxiety blossomed into a full-blown panic. A search was organized, a desperate canvassing of the places she might be. The first discovery was her car. It was found abandoned on the side of a nearby road, an island of familiar metal in an unfamiliar context. The sight of it, empty and still, sent a chill through everyone who saw it. It was a clear signal that something was terribly wrong. The search party, their hearts pounding with a grim premonition, moved to the house where she had been staying. When authorities finally forced their way inside, the quiet of the home gave way to a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Andrea in the basement laundry room. She was not just dead, she had been executed. She was bound to a chair, her body held captive even in death. A single gunshot wound to her head had ended her life. The scene was bizarrely staged, a tableau of violence that was both intimate and chillingly impersonal. The young woman who had been house-sitting, the girl with the bright future, had been stolen from the world in an act of brutal, incomprehensible cruelty. The question that hung in the cold, still air of the basement was not just who had done this, but why. The investigation, launched by the Michigan State Police, immediately zeroed in on the person closest to Andrea, her boyfriend, Casey Grondin. In the chaotic aftermath of a murder, suspicion almost always falls first on the inner circle, and Casey was at its very center. He was brought in for questioning, a 19-year-old boy suddenly thrust into the harsh, disorienting world of a homicide investigation. Without a lawyer present, he faced a grueling, 13-hour interrogation. Casey never confessed to the murder. Throughout the long hours of questioning, he maintained his innocence. But his story was a tangled mess of inconsistencies and contradictions. At one point, in a statement that would come to haunt him, he claimed he had found Andrea already dead. He said he believed she had taken her own life, and, in a panic-stricken attempt to protect her reputation, he had staged the scene. He later recanted this bizarre claim, but the damage was done. To the investigators, his shifting narrative was not the mark of a terrified, grieving teenager, but the telltale sign of a guilty conscience. While Casey was being interrogated, a lawyer retained by his grandfather arrived at the police station. In a move that would later become a critical point of legal contention, the police denied the lawyer access to his client. Casey, unaware that legal help was just outside the door, continued to talk, his words weaving a web that would soon entrap him. Based on his inconsistent statements and what investigators saw as his suspicious behavior, Kenneth Casey, Grondin III, was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of the woman he loved. The trial, held in 2015, was a tense, 12-day affair that captivated the local community. The prosecution built its case on a foundation of circumstantial evidence. Their star witness was Casey himself, or rather, the words he had spoken during that long night of interrogation. His conflicting stories were presented to the jury as a clear indication of guilt. They also presented a key piece of forensic evidence, a single hair found on Casey's clothing that contained Andrea's blood. It was a tangible link, they argued, between the accused and the victim. The defense fought back, chipping away at the prosecution's narrative. They argued that the hair was not a smoking gun, but an inevitable byproduct of a close relationship. Of course, he might have a trace of his girlfriend's DNA on him. They pointed to the significant holes in the police investigation. A cigarette butt had been found at the crime scene, containing the DNA of an unidentified male. This DNA did not match KC, nor anyone else known to be connected to the case. Who is this mystery man? The defense also presented CCTV footage from a nearby ATM, which showed an individual attempting to use Andrea's debit card after she was killed. They argued that the grainy figure in the footage bore no resemblance to Casey. The prosecution dismissed these points as irrelevant distractions. The man at the ATM, they contended, could have been Casey, and even if it wasn't, it didn't change the evidence against him. The unidentified DNA was a loose end, nothing more. After deliberating, the jury sided with the prosecution. They found Casey Grandin guilty of the murder of Andrea Alber. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, his family's cries of disbelief echoed in the courtroom. He had always maintained his innocence, and now he was facing a lifetime behind bars for a crime he insisted he did not commit. For the Alber family, the verdict was a form of closure, a confirmation that the man responsible for their daughter's death would be held accountable. But for the Grandin family, it was the beginning of a new, desperate fight. They believed in Casey's innocence, and they poured their resources and their energy into the appeals process. For years, their efforts were met with frustration. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough. An appellate court overturned Casey's conviction. The reason was not a grand pronouncement of his innocence or a condemnation of the police interrogation. It was a clerical error, a technical flaw in the verdict form used during his trial. It was a small crack in the legal edifice, but it was enough. The conviction was vacated, and a new trial was ordered. After years in prison, Casey Grandin was granted bail and released, albeit under the strict conditions of house arrest, to await a second trial. As Casey's defense team prepared for the retrial, they made a startling discovery. They learned that additional DNA, matching the profile from the cigarette butt, had been found at the crime scene. This information had not been disclosed to them during the first trial. The presence of this unidentified male DNA was now more than just a loose end. It was a significant piece of exculpatory evidence. Faced with this new complication, the prosecution made a fateful decision. In 2022, more than a decade after Andrea's murder, the Michigan State Police submitted the DNA evidence from the cigarette butt to Othram, a private lab in Texas specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. This cutting-edge science, which had been used to crack dozens of cold cases, involves building a comprehensive DNA profile and then using it to search public genealogy databases, identifying distant relatives of the unknown individual, and building a family tree that can lead back to the suspect. The lab went to work. From the tiny, degraded sample of DNA left on a discarded cigarette 10 years earlier, Othram scientists built a profile. Their in-house genealogy team began their painstaking work, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of DNA through generations. They developed a new investigative lead and returned it to the Michigan State Police. The lead pointed to a man named Chadwick Shane Mobley. At 42 years old, Mobley was a long-haul truck driver who had been living out of his rig. At the time of Andrea's murder in 2011, he was 31 and had been working as an EMS technician in Pontiac, Michigan, living in the nearby suburb of Auburn Hills. His name had never once surfaced during the initial investigation. He was a ghost, a complete unknown. Identifying him was one thing. Proving he was the man they were looking for was another. Investigators in Utah and Montana, where Mobley was working, began a covert surveillance operation. They needed a confirmatory DNA sample, a piece of his discarded DNA to match directly against the crime scene evidence. But Mobley's transient lifestyle made it incredibly difficult. He rarely disposed of anything that could be collected. Eventually, they got their sample. The results came back. It was a perfect match. The DNA on the cigarette but belonged to Chadwick Mobley. Law enforcement moved in. They went to arrest him, but Mobley was gone. He had vanished into the wind. After a manhunt, they located him again and made the arrest. The journey to bring him to justice was far from over. While being transported back to Michigan by U.S. Marshals, Mobley pulled off a daring escape. In a scene that felt ripped from a Hollywood thriller, he slipped his handcuffs and ankle shackles and fled, sparking another frantic, multi-day search. He was eventually found and recaptured, but his desperate attempt to escape only strengthened the suspicion against him. The case against Mobley grew stronger still. When investigators searched his vehicle, they found a firearm. Ballistic testing confirmed it was the weapon used to kill Andrea Alber. The chain of evidence was now complete. The DNA placed him at the scene, and the murder weapon was in his possession. In the face of this overwhelming evidence, Chadwick Mobley's facade crumbled. On February 17, 2025, he pleaded no contest to charges of first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and felony firearm. A no-contest plea is not an admission of guilt, but it is treated as one for sentencing purposes. He was offering no explanation, no story, no motive. He was simply accepting his fate. On April 15, 2025, he was sentenced to the same fate that had once been handed to Casey Grondin: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Casey Grondin and his family, the news should have been a moment of ultimate vindication. The real killer had been found and convicted. The science had proven what they had known all along. Casey was innocent. His lawyer immediately asked the Michigan Attorney General's office to drop the charges against his client. But the prosecution refused. In a stunning and controversial move, the district attorney announced that the charges against Casey Grondin would remain active. They declared him a co-defendant in the murder of Andrea Alber. Their new theory was that this was not the act of a lone killer, but a conspiracy. They alleged that Casey Grondin and Chadwick Mobley had worked together to murder Andrea. This theory was met with widespread incredulity. There was no known connection between the two men. Casey was a 19-year-old student living in rural Lapeer. Mobley was a 31-year-old married paramedic and father living in a suburb of Pontiac, 30 miles away. They moved in different worlds, had different lives, and had no apparent reason to even know each other, let alone conspire to commit murder. The prosecution, however, pointed to cell phone data that pinged both men at or near the crime scene on the night of the murder. They suggested that this was evidence of coordination, that the two men were at the house together for at least 45 minutes. They theorized that Mobley was communicating with Grondin using Andrea's phone, luring him to the scene. The motive, they now argued, was robbery. They claimed the plan was to steal money from Andrea's debit card, and that this required inside knowledge, like the fact that Andrea would be alone, that only Casey could have provided. The defense and Casey's supporters called this theory preposterous. The cell phone pings were not precise enough to prove the men were together, only that they were in the same general area. The idea of a conspiracy was a desperate attempt by the prosecution to save face, to avoid having to admit that they had convicted the wrong man, a conviction built on a coerced, false narrative and a flawed investigation. They feared that dropping the charges against Casey would open the door to a massive wrongful conviction lawsuit. As of October 2025, the case remains in a state of surreal legal limbo. Chadwick Mobley, the man whose DNA was at the scene and whose gun was the murder weapon, is serving a life sentence. Casey Grondin, the man whose conviction was overturned, is free but still facing a murder charge for the same crime, his retrial still pending on the court docket. The story of Andrea Alber's murder is no longer a simple whodunit. It has become a bewildering saga of two conflicting realities, two narratives of justice that cannot both be true. One man is in prison, his guilt established by science. Another man is trapped in a legal nightmare, his name still tied to a crime that science says another man committed. For Andrea's family, the grief is compounded by the confusion, the certainty of one conviction now muddied by the possibility of another. And for the justice system in Lapeer County, the case of Andrea Alber has become a haunting testament to the fallibility of human judgment and the extraordinary power of science to both solve a crime and expose a potential injustice, leaving a community to grapple with the agonizing question of which truth to believe.